In 1961, a book was published with the title Jesse James and the Lost Cause. The book was authored by a man who claimed to be Jesse's grandson, Jesse L. James, also known, according to him, as Jesse James III, the Hawk. Now, the cover of that book features what is alleged to be a photo of the notorious outlaw holding 2 pistols across his chest. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, number one, this photo isn't really a widely known photo, and number two, I'm pretty sure that it's rejected by almost all Jesse James historians as not being a photo of Jesse James. I know specifically one person that claimed that this photo was not Jesse James, but rather a photo of Sheriff James Timberlake that fought with Jesse James. But frankly, I don't see any more evidence for that position than the position that it's Jesse, so that's really not helpful at all. As far as I can tell, the only time this photo was widely shown other than being on the cover of this book is in a 2018 article published by the Daily Mail about Jesse James. But other than that, I really can't find a source or any indication that it's been broadly distributed. I also looked in my files, and somehow I actually have a version of my file that shows even more of the image than either of these 2 photos and is not cropped at all. So somehow in my travels, I've gotten an original copy of this image that is apparently the complete image. The only problem I have is I actually don't remember where I got it. It could have been in Mr. Morrison's papers, or it could have been given to me by someone else over the years. Unfortunately, I just don't remember. Now, if you know where it came from, please send me a note or put it in the comments, but as far as I know, all we have is that the author of Jesse James and the Lost Cause claimed that it was a photo of the real Jesse James. But I want to jump ahead and show you where I'm going with this before I go through all the details of how I got here. And where I'm going is I want to know if this guy is the same person as this guy serving in the Rough Riders. Now, I'm not going to try to prove to you that that's the case. I'm only bringing you into my research as a participant, and you are welcome to comment or add any value that you want to. Part of my commitment to channel members was to give you more access to my private research, and so here you go. This is wet cement. I don't have all the answers, and I'm not an expert on Jesse James, but I'm going to share with you what I found. I see a lot of similarities in beard, hairstyle, facial features, and many other things. I even looked very closely at his left index finger, and I guess you could say that perhaps he's missing the tip in this photo. Unfortunately, I don't think the resolution is really good enough to be conclusive one way or the other, but I think it's very, very interesting. But let's start in the beginning. Back in the 1950s, J. Frank Dalton had a caretaker named Ola Everhart, and she spent hundreds of hours by his side taking care of him in his old age. Ola was not a historian or a journalist. She was a sweet country lady who had a fond affection for J. Frank Dalton, and she wrote down a lot of what J. Frank Dalton told her, and she intended to write a book about it someday. For his part, I don't believe Dalton really told Ola much that could get her in trouble. He told her he hadn't buried any gold, and I genuinely think he was trying to deflect so that she wouldn't get in trouble, because there were some very bad people around J. Frank Dalton that some say actually at the end of his life kidnapped him and tortured him, trying to get him to tell them where he had buried gold as Jesse James. Regardless, after Dalton died in 1951, Ola continued to write her manuscript, but unfortunately she died before it was published. For decades, people wondered what she wrote in that unpublished manuscript, and after her husband Aubrey died, everyone wondered where it went. Well, we now know that that manuscript went to Bud Hardcastle, and Bud has done more research on J. Frank Dalton than anyone alive. Aubrey gave Ola's manuscript to Bud in exchange for his promise that he would get it published someday. In 2021, Bud kept his promise, and the manuscript was published with the title, The Hoax That Let Jesse James Live. Now, for the first time in 70 years, we could read what J. Frank Dalton told his caregiver, Ola Everhart. Now, as I mentioned, I think Dalton tried to protect Ola and didn't tell her much. So basically, as I'm reading through Ola's manuscript, I try to take the same approach with it that I had taken with Alias Billy the Kid, and I wanted to look at the mundane things that Dalton had supposedly said and see if I could find any corroboration in the historical record. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, Ola was not nearly as buttoned up as Mr. Morrison, so I don't think I found really that much. But in the information is a little nugget that J. Frank Dalton claimed to have been in the Rough Riders, serving under the name of J.G. Hood. So I looked through the rolls and I found a James G. Hood, a wagoner in Company D. I began researching and found these photos of troopers from Company D, and in my opinion, as I stated, the gentleman reading the paper looked a lot like the photo on the cover of Jesse James and the Lost Cause. But there's more, actually a whole lot more. The author of that book's real name is obviously not Jesse L. James or even Jesse James III. His real name is Orvus Lee Howk, and he was another person that was around J. Frank Dalton during the last year or so of his life. He is also allegedly the person that kidnapped Dalton at gunpoint and then supposedly tortured him to get him to tell him more information about the Knights of the Golden Circle. I don't know if that's true, but that is the story. Now, here's where it gets really interesting if you've never heard of the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle was supposedly a secret society with the aim of establishing a nation for the Southern cause. Basically, the idea was that the South would rise again after the Civil War, and that Jesse James was actually not robbing for his own benefit, but was robbing the Northern interests as sort of a way of fundraising to fund a new Confederate army. I find it interesting that a lot of people make fun of the Knights of the Golden Circle, but in my research, I found that during the Civil War, they are mentioned on the front page of the New York Times, and the gist of the article is that they are very concerned about these people that are in the secret society, even alleging that members of Congress are members and that they have infiltrated the government. I can also tell you that there's some tie into John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln, and in my research I found there was actually multiple attempts to get Abraham Lincoln, and the initial plan was to kidnap him on his way to Richmond. That plan was aborted, but one of the people involved in that plot was none other than Frank James, the brother of Jesse James. So, as you get into all this world of secret societies and the Civil War and the South will rise again and J. Frank Dalton and Jesse James, I just want to say it is a very, very complicated subject, and I have not come out with any positions on this other than I know it was a real society because there's documentation of it. The size and scope and how big it was and all that, I'm not ready to give an opinion on. But I can tell you this. Although it's not mentioned by name in the correspondence between Mr. Morrison and Brushy Bill Roberts, I can tell you that there was evidence in Mr. Morrison's papers that Brushy Bill may be entitled to property obtained by his father when he rode with Jesse James, and there's also stories about Brushy Bill wanting to go and dig up gold in Round Rock, Texas, and then thinking better of it and saying that he had better leave it alone. Now that last part I've personally found to be very interesting because it would seem to me that it would indicate that Brushy, who definitely could have used the money, didn't want to cross the people that buried that gold. Were those Knights of the Golden Circle people? Possibly. We just don't know. But let's get back to Orvus Lee Howk. What nobody knows, and I'm revealing for the first time, is that Brushy Bill Roberts had photographs of a number of Wild West characters, including Jesse James, and that he had given those photos to Orvus Howk to borrow as a favor to J. Frank Dalton. Well, Howk was supposed to send the photos back, but he never did. And as it turns out, he was attempting to sell Dalton's story and the photos to a prominent magazine. He also figured out from Dalton that Brushy was Billy the Kid and was attempting to get Brushy to sign a contract with him to sell his story. Brushy wanted nothing to do with Howk and denied that he was Billy the Kid. So again, what the modern amateur drive-by historians don't realize is that Morrison was definitely acting as Brushy Bill's lawyer, and I have all of that legal correspondence. Part of what he did for Mr. Roberts, in addition to working on his petition for pardon, was to handle the legal matters needed to deal with Howk and also the major publishing company that Howk was in contact with in an effort to get Brushy Bill Roberts' photos returned to him. What followed was a long game of trying to run Mr. Morrison around. Howk would say that the publisher had the photos, and the publisher would say that Howk had the photos. And until they were used or turned up somewhere, there was really nothing Morrison could do. Now my hunch, and that's the hunch that I'm investigating, is that those photos did start to turn up when Howk began publishing his books. And I'm investigating whether or not that photo of Jesse James on the cover of Jesse James and the Lost Cause is actually a photo owned by Brushy Bill Roberts. But this also brings us to an interesting sidebar of Brushy Bill's story, and that was that apparently J. Frank Dalton had begun to out his identity as Billy the Kid to multiple people, and this was making Brushy Bill very nervous. Dalton had told Howk, and Dalton had also told Morrison, and Brushy couldn't know who else he was telling. I don't know if Dalton was starting to lose his marbles or not, but he was definitely outing Brushy Bill to multiple people. For his part, Brushy did the only thing that he could do, which was to vehemently deny being Billy the Kid. He also insisted on no publicity, and he repeatedly said that he didn't want his picture in any magazine or newspaper. But, as we know, asking and getting are two different things, and he had to be worried that more and more people started to find him in his tiny little town of Hyco, Texas, and they were identifying him as Billy the Kid. I personally believe this played a major role in his decision to confide in Mr. Morrison and go for his pardon. His options were limited at that point, and if he was going to be found out, at least he could make a shot to get ahead of it and to get his pardon before he was exposed and possibly arrested. But we all know what happened with that, and this story is about Jesse James. Now, leaving aside for the moment the content of that book, all the claims of Orvus Howk and the Knights of the Golden Circle and all that, and focusing simply on the cover photo of the book, let me say that my personal belief is that this photo that Howk used may be one of the photos that Mr. Morrison describes based on the information given to him by Brushy Bill. I say this only because in one of his letters Mr. Morrison sends out as Brushy's lawyer, he lists the missing photos and describes what the photos contain. Now, do I know for sure that the photo on the cover of Howk's book is Brushy's photo? No, I only have a strong suspicion, and that's why I'm investigating it. I'm going to continue to research, and I will continue to share what I find on this channel. Thanks for watching.